Hey there, we're about to talk about someone whose name is recognized by billions, but whose real story is often lost in formality, politics, and assumptions. I want to share the untold truth about the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, not as a distant figure in history, but as a human being whose life has something urgent to teach all of us. So let's dive in. When we think of someone whose influence changed the course of history, we often put them on a pedestal. We imagine them as larger than life, almost untouchable. But here's the truth that most people don't talk about when it comes to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. He was fully human, completely relatable, and deeply real. And that's exactly what made him so powerful. He didn't start his life in power. He didn't grow up in a palace or attend elite schools. He was born into a modest clan in Mecca, and by the age of 6, he had lost both of his parents. Just imagine that. A child alone in a world without modern systems of care or social safety net. He was raised by his grandfather for 2 years, and then by his uncle who supported him but wasn't wealthy himself. That early loss and instability, it didn't break him, it built a deep well of empathy inside him. It made him the kind of man who would stop everything just to check on someone's emotional state. That's not abstract compassion, that's lived compassion. He didn't have money, influence, or status in his youth. What he did have was a reputation. Even before he received any divine revelation, people called him Al-Amin, the trustworthy. Why? Because his character wasn't tied to circumstances. It was built through day-to-day honesty, consistency, and humility. He didn't speak often, but when he did, it mattered. He didn't demand attention, but people noticed him. And when people did wrong by him, and they did, often he didn't respond with vengeance. He responded with clarity, boundaries, and grace. And yes, he felt pain, deep personal pain. This is someone who buried multiple children with his own hands. Do you know how devastating that is? He cried, he grieved, and yet he never became bitter. When his enemies mocked him, when they threw dirt on him, when they exiled him from his homeland, he didn't spiral into rage. He didn't seek revenge. He turned toward purpose. That's not sainthood. That's emotional resilience. That's what it looks like when you have a vision that's bigger than your ego. His marriage to Khadija, R.A., wasn't just romantic. It was a partnership grounded in mutual respect and support. She believed in him when no one else did. She was his emotional anchor, and he never forgot that. He wasn't threatened by her success or her independence, he was inspired by it. Their relationship tells us that he wasn't just a spiritual leader, he was a deeply emotionally intelligent man who knew how to show up for his people. Now here's something even more telling. When revelation came to him at the age of 40, his first response wasn't arrogance. It wasn't entitlement. It was fear, confusion, vulnerability. He ran to his wife and said, "Cover me." That one moment tells us volumes. This is someone who understood the gravity of responsibility. He never claimed perfection. In fact, throughout his life, he remained grounded in his humanity. He got tired. He got frustrated. He sought solitude. He took counsel from others. He never stopped growing. That's the untold truth. The Prophet PBO didn't lead because he was perfect. He led because he was aware, because he stayed connected to people at the most human level. He didn't pretend to be someone else. He didn't build an empire. He built trust. He didn't demand loyalty. He inspired it. And that is why his example still resonates today, not just as a spiritual icon, but as a real human being who faced what we all face: fear, doubt, grief, love, responsibility, and turned it into something transformational. Would you like the second keynote expanded in a similar way? You said expand the second keynote without headings and NTRO of keynote up to 600 words. ChatGPT said, of course. Here is the expanded version of the second keynote, focused on the Prophet Muhammad PBO Che as a problem solver in a clear educational tone with Mel Robbins-style delivery. It's engaging, grounded in reality, and speaks to the reader with urgency and relevance. The world that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, lived in was not some romanticized ancient utopia. It was a place riddled with inequality, injustice, tribal warfare, and systemic dysfunction. Mecca in the 6th and 7th centuries was a tribal society where power belonged to a few and survival depended on your clan, not your character. The weak were exploited, women were voiceless, the poor were invisible. The strong controlled religion, commerce, and culture, and they used that control to serve themselves. If you think today's world is chaotic, that world was operating with zero laws, zero regulation, and zero vision beyond profit and power. And yet, in the middle of that chaos, there stood one man who didn't just react emotionally to the mess. He responded with strategy. The Prophet Muhammad didn't come down from a mountain screaming judgment. He didn't wage war from the beginning or burn down the system. He studied it, he engaged it, and then one by one he began solving the root problems that fed the chaos. He challenged corruption without being corrupted by it. That's what made him more than a preacher. He was a reformer, a builder, a systems thinker. Take the example of the tribal conflict over the black stone, the sacred symbol in the Kaaba. Multiple powerful tribes were about to go to war over who would have the honor of placing it in its rightful position during the reconstruction. Tensions were at a breaking point. Bloodshed was inevitable, but when the Prophet arrived, he didn't just pick a side. He didn't give a speech about peace. He gave them a solution they could all agree on. He placed the black stone on a cloth and asked each tribe to lift it together. Then he placed it himself. That moment didn't just prevent violence. It created unity through fairness. That wasn't diplomacy. That was problem solving under pressure. When he received revelation and began spreading the message of Islam, he didn't just speak in religious terms. He addressed real practical issues that people were facing every day: debt, oppression, exploitation, corruption in trade, abuse of power. He taught honesty in business and fairness in trade. He advocated for the rights of orphans and the fair treatment of labor. These weren't abstract ideals, they were targeted solutions to structural problems. And every single move he made was calculated to make lasting change, not just temporary peace. What's even more powerful is how he dealt with opposition. The elite of Mecca, people with wealth, political clout, and economic control, tried everything to stop him. They offered him power, status, wealth, and leadership if he would just compromise. He refused, not because he was stubborn, but because he was laser-focused on the kind of world he was trying to build. He understood that real change doesn't come from aligning with corrupt systems. It comes from reforming them, step by step, person by person. Even in Medina, after he migrated, the work didn't stop. He helped create a constitution, yes, a legal document that outlined the rights of Muslims, Jews, and other communities to live together in peace. This wasn't just religious leadership. This was civic innovation, social engineering. He resolved disputes, enforced contracts, ensured fair treatment for minorities, and trained people to think about responsibility, not just rights. He built an ethical framework in a time and place where ethics were fluid at best. And maybe the most remarkable thing, he never lost his clarity. He never sacrificed his core values in the name of strategy. His solutions were not quick fixes. They were designed to teach people how to live, lead, and serve with integrity. That's what made him different. He didn't just react to problems, he solved them with purpose, clarity, and long-term vision. That's not just leadership. That's transformation. Certainly, below is the expanded version of the third keynote, focused on the emotional intelligence of the Prophet Muhammad PBO. It's written in an educational yet dynamic style inspired by Mel Robbins, clear, personal, and actionable. We often talk about emotional intelligence like it's some modern discovery, something from psychology books or TED Talks. But more than 11400 years ago, there was a man living, practicing it, embodying it every single day. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, didn't just know how to read people. He cared about them on a level most leaders today can only dream of. He didn't command attention through force. He earned hearts through emotional presence, patience, and precision. When people spoke to him, he didn't multitask. He didn't interrupt. He didn't look around the room. He turned his entire body toward the person talking. He made eye contact. He gave them his full attention, like they were the only person in the world. That simple act, being fully present, made people feel seen. And here's the amazing part. This wasn't reserved for kings or influential figures. He did it for everyone. A child, a servant, a stranger. Emotional intelligence isn't just about managing your own emotions. It's about making others feel safe, valued, and heard. He mastered that. He could walk into a room and sense if someone was distressed. He would notice when a person's tone shifted. He asked about people's feelings, not just their actions. And he didn't just console them, he responded appropriately, whether that meant giving space, offering encouragement, or simply listening without judgment. That's empathy. And he did it not as a strategy but as a natural part of who he was. Even when people were angry with him or made mistakes, he didn't escalate. He slowed down. He responded calmly. There's a moment when a man comes and grabs the Prophet's cloak so harshly that it leaves a mark on his neck, demanding money. Most people would react instantly, defend themselves, raise their voice, push back. But the Prophet stayed calm. He smiled. He acknowledged the man's frustration, and then he gave him what he needed. That's self-control. That's emotional discipline in real time. That's someone who didn't let other people's behavior dictate his character. Think about how he dealt with criticism, insults, humiliation. It happened constantly. He was mocked in public, called names, ridiculed by his own tribe, but he never let those insults shape his self-worth. He didn't mirror the negativity. He stayed rooted in clarity, not ego. He knew that responding with anger wasn't strength, it was reaction. And he chose response over reaction, every single time. What's also incredible is the way he understood people's emotional needs before they even said a word. There's a story of a grieving woman sitting by her child's grave, overcome with sorrow. The Prophet approaches her to offer comfort, but she doesn't recognize him and says, "You can't understand what I'm going through." Instead of correcting her or telling her who he was, he quietly walks away, giving her space. Later, when she realizes who he was, she's deeply moved. That's not just wisdom. That's emotional maturity. He validated people's emotions, not by solving all their problems but by being with them in the hard moments. He cried when his son passed away. He didn't hide his tears. He didn't pretend to be stoic. He showed people that you could be strong and soft at the same time. That emotional transparency wasn't weakness, it was connection. And that's the part we miss. His emotional intelligence wasn't an accessory to his leadership. It was his leadership. It was the foundation of how he built trust, repaired hearts, unified people, and led a movement that transformed the world. Not through fear but through understanding. That's what made him unforgettable. Not just what he said, but how he made people feel. If you want to understand how revolutionary the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was, you need to look at how he treated women. Not just in theory but in practice, because this is one of the most misunderstood and misrepresented parts of his legacy. The truth is, the society he was born into was deeply patriarchal and in many cases violently misogynistic. Women had almost no legal rights. They were often considered property. Daughters were seen as burdens. Some tribes even buried baby girls alive because they were seen as a source of shame. That's the environment. That's what he was working against. Now enter the Prophet, one man with no political power, no army, no status, and a message that directly challenged those norms. From the very beginning of his mission, he didn't just speak on behalf of women, he stood with them. He didn't offer pity, he offered justice. His own life set the tone. His first and most loyal supporter, a woman, his wife Khadijah. She wasn't just his partner emotionally, she was a successful businesswoman. Older than him, more experienced and financially independent. He didn't feel threatened by that. He respected her leadership. He worked for her before she married him, and when she believed in him, she became the first Muslim, not the first wife, not the first female, the first believer. That alone flips the narrative many people. But it didn't stop there. As his mission grew, women were not just included, they were integral. He gave women the right to inherit, to own property, to keep their earnings. He gave them the right to choose their spouse and to seek divorce if they were mistreated at a time when that idea was unheard of. He spoke out publicly against the abuse of women, warning men that the best of them were those who treated their wives with kindness and honor. And it wasn't just personal advice, it was systemic reform. He taught that women were spiritually equal to men, that their acts of worship, their charity, their service were just as valuable. He responded to the needs of women in his community. He listened when they asked questions. He took their concerns seriously. In fact, some chapters of the Qur'an were revealed because women came to him and asked for justice. Think about that. Women, at a time when they had no social power, could come directly to the Prophet and raise issues, and he responded with revelation, with law, with respect. One of his wives, Aisha, was one of the greatest scholars in Islamic history. She narrated hundreds of Hadith, or sayings of the Prophet, men high-ranking companions and future leaders would come to her for religious rulings and interpretations. She taught in public, she led, she debated, and the Prophet encouraged that. He never told her to stay silent. He never asked her to shrink herself. That's not accidental, that's leadership by example. He also showed gentleness in the everyday moments. He helped with housework. He mended his own clothes. He never raised a hand to any of his wives. He said that women were partners, not subordinate. And he made it clear that how a man treats his wife is a direct reflection of his character. So when people say the Prophet oppressed women, the truth is they haven't looked closely enough. He didn't just improve women's status, he redefined, he created space for their voices, their intellect, their leadership, and their rights in a society that had erased them. He didn't do it with a campaign, he did it through consistent personal action, through law, through spiritual teaching, through culture shift. That is not just progress, that is transformation, and it happened because he saw women not as problems to manage, but as equal souls to empower. Absolutely, here is the expanded version of the fifth keynote, focusing on the Prophet Muhammad's, peace be upon him, incredible leadership style. This is delivered in a clear educational tone, with the urgency, realness and motivational energy that echoes Mel Robbins, direct, relevant and grounded in truth. Leadership isn't about titles, it's not about who shouts the loudest, or who sits at the head of the table. Real leadership is about service, consistency, and influence that outlives you. And when you study the life of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, what becomes clear is that he didn't just lead people, he transformed them. He didn't need to control people to be respected. He didn't need a throne to be followed. What made him a leader was that he led by example with humility, integrity, and purpose. He wasn't the kind of leader who separated himself from the people. He didn't isolate himself in a palace or demand special treatment. He stood in the same line, ate the same food, sat on the ground, worked with his hands. When the community built the mosque in Medina, he didn't sit back and supervise. He picked up bricks alongside everyone else. When a trench needed to be dug to defend the city, he didn't just issue orders. He grabbed a shovel. His sleeves were rolled up, literally. That's not performative leadership, that's authentic, boots on the ground leadership, and it's why people trusted him, because he never asked anyone to do something he wasn't already doing himself. Even when he became the most powerful person in Arabia, his behavior didn't change. There's a moment after the conquest of Mecca, when the city that once exiled him, mocked him, and tried to kill him, was now at his feet. He had every opportunity for revenge, but instead he forgave them, not out of weakness but out of strength. That's emotional control, that's long-term vision, that's leadership rooted in principle, not ego. And the way he built his team, his companions, shows you the depth of his leadership. He didn't hoard power, he empowered people, he trained them, mentored them, and trusted them with responsibility. He took people who were once slaves, outcasts, and rivals, and turned them into leaders of their own communities. He didn't choose people based on wealth or lineage. He chose them based on character, sincerity, and potential. He saw value in people before they saw it in themselves. That's what great leaders do. They don't compete with their team. They lift them. And here's something that stands out even more. He listened, not just to show politeness, but to learn. He held consultations before major decisions. He encouraged feedback. He changed his course when better ideas were brought forward, even from people much younger than him. That's humility in leadership. That's recognizing that wisdom isn't tied to age or rank, it's tied to truth. He also knew how to lead with clarity. He communicated in a way that people could understand. He used examples, stories, analogies. He met people where they were, whether someone was a Bedouin from the desert, or a scholar from another land. The Prophet could connect, explain and guide them in a way that made sense. He didn't overcomplicate the message. He didn't make people feel small. He lifted them by speaking in ways they could internalize and act upon. Even in moments of crisis, he didn't panic. He led with composure. During the Battle of Uhud, when things took a difficult turn, he didn't retreat into blame or despair. He adapted, he encouraged, he refocused the team. That ability to stay calm under fire, to hold people together when everything's falling apart, that's leadership at the highest level. And through it all, he never lost sight of the mission. His leadership wasn't about building a personal empire, it was about service to something higher, a purpose that went beyond him. That's why we still talk about it today, not as a model from the past, but as a standard for leadership that still applies now, because he didn't just lead by words, he led by character, and that kind of leadership is timeless, of course. Here is the expanded version of the sixth and final keynote, focusing on the lasting global impact of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. The tone remains educational, empowering, and grounded, delivered with the clarity and urgency of Mel Robbins. One of the biggest misconceptions people have about Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, is that his impact was limited to a religious circle, confined to rituals and beliefs. But if you zoom out and look at history with clear, honest eyes, the truth is undeniable. This one man, in the span of just 23 years, reshaped not just the spiritual lives of millions, but social structures, economic systems, political models, and even international relations. The impact was total. The ripple effect is still unfolding, and he did it without violence-driven conquest, without inherited privilege, and without massive institutions backing him. He started alone, one man, with a message. But what made that message so powerful is that it addressed every part of life, not just how to worship, but how to live, how to lead, how to raise families, how to build communities, how to balance justice with mercy. His teachings created a complete model and operating system for society, and the brilliance was in the balance. It wasn't idealistic theory, it was grounded, real-world applicable guidance that spoke to both the heart and the mind. Look at what happened in the years after his death. Entire empires, Persian, Roman, stood in shock because within a generation, the values he taught gave birth to one of the most advanced civilizations of its time. We're talking about a civilization that preserved knowledge when others were burning books, that pioneered hospitals, universities, algebra, astronomy, and public libraries, driven by a worldview that the Prophet had laid down: seek knowledge from the cradle to the grave. That one sentence built intellectual culture. And it wasn't just a Muslim thing. His followers learned from, translated, and expanded on the works of Greeks, Persians, Indians, and Romans. They created bridges between civilizations. Why? Because he taught them to engage the world, not retreat from it, to elevate humanity, not isolate from it. He also planted the foundation of ethics in leadership that's still relevant today. Ideas like transparency in governance, accountability, the prohibition of bribery, the protection of rights. These weren't theoretical, these were lived values under his leadership, and they became embedded in the political DNA of Islamic civilizations. His farewell sermon alone, a document not even a page long, laid out principles of equality, women's rights, the sanctity of life and property, and racial justice, in one speech, over 1400 years ago. And even in today's world, where misinformation and cultural bias can distort his legacy, the impact is still there. Millions across every continent name their children after him. Billions look to his words for daily decisions, from business ethics to mental health. His life is studied not just in Islamic institutions, but in comparative religion, law, sociology, and even leadership courses, because people are starting to realize something. This wasn't just a man who built a religion, he built a civilization. He shifted human history, and he did it not by conquering land, but by conquering hearts, not through force but through influence. Because when people saw him, they changed. They rose to higher standards. They took ownership of their behavior. They treated others with more compassion. That's not power in the traditional sense. That's transformation. So if you're looking for a case study in impact, if you're wondering how one human being can create meaningful, lasting change, look no further. The Prophet Muhammad's, PBOU's legacy didn't end with his life. It began with, and it continues to live in values, in systems, in minds, and in hearts across the globe. That's the kind of legacy that doesn't fade. That's the kind of leadership that echoes forever. So here's what we've uncovered. The untold truth about the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, isn't that he simply changed lives. It's that he transformed the very meaning of how to live, how to lead, and how to elevate the human experience. He wasn't just a spiritual figure. He was a reformer, a problem solver, a master of emotional intelligence, a revolutionary advocate for women's rights, a servant leader who never asked others to do what he wasn't willing to do himself, and a global changemaker whose impact continues to shape the world in ways most people don't even realize. And what makes his legacy extraordinary is that it was never about him. It was never about power, praise, or personal gain. It was about raising a generation that could build something bigger than themselves. It was about justice when it was inconvenient, mercy when it was unexpected, vision when others were blinded by survival. That's not just history, that's a model, that's a wake-up call. Because if we're serious about truth, if we're serious about leadership, human rights, empathy, purpose and transformation, then we owe it to ourselves to study his life, not from a distance, but up close, with fresh eyes, with honesty, and with the courage to say there was something we missed, and it's time we stop overlooking it, because the truth, it was never hidden, we just weren't looking close enough. And now that you know, what will you do with it?